She never raised her voice. She never told her story in anger. She never demanded the world feel sorry for her. And that may be the most heartbreaking part. To the public, Aaliyah looked untouched by chaos. Calm, poised, always in control. While other stars burned out loudly, she moved quietly, carefully, almost invisibly through fame. At just 22 years old, she had already done what most artists never reach in a lifetime. But silence can be learned, and control is often a survival skill. From a young age, she understood something the industry rewards deeply. Do not complain. Do not disrupt. Do not reveal what might make people uncomfortable, especially when powerful men are involved, especially when success depends on staying agreeable. So she smiled. She worked harder. She showed up on time. She gave interviews without saying too much. She let the music speak instead. And for a while, that worked. The world saw grace. What it did not see was the weight of what had been swallowed to protect that image. This is not a story about sudden tragedy. It is a story about long endurance, about what happens when a child learns too early that strength means staying quiet, when professionalism is praised more than safety, when surviving becomes mistaken for healing. Her life ended in a moment, but the damage was done long before. And the question we must ask now is not only how she died, it is how she lived with so much while saying so little. Before fame ever entered her life, she learned how to behave, not from managers or executives, but from the environment she grew up in. Performance came naturally, but composure had to be learned. From the start, she understood that being talented was not enough. You also had to be agreeable. Music surrounded her childhood. Singing was encouraged. Applause was familiar. Family gatherings, school stages, church choirs. These were places where she felt seen, but also observed. Even as a child, she carried herself with a calm that adults found reassuring. She listened more than she spoke. She followed direction well. People noticed how easy she was to work with. That quality followed her into the industry. By the time she was barely a teenager, professional doors were already opening. Adults with experience stepped in to guide her path. Contracts were explained. Studio schedules were arranged. Creative decisions were framed as protection. She was told this was how things worked, and she believed them. At 12 years old, she signed her first record deal. Most children at that age are still discovering who they are. She was being introduced to branding, image, and long-term strategy. She was praised for being focused, for being disciplined, for not acting her age. When her debut album arrived, it presented a version of maturity that felt far beyond her years. The sound was confident. The visuals were controlled. The messaging suggested self-assurance and choice. The audience responded immediately. Millions listened. The industry celebrated. But there was a quiet contradiction. The voice sounded grown. The face looked young. And the person behind both was still learning where her boundaries were allowed to exist. What stood out most during these early years was not rebellion, but obedience. She trusted the adults around her. Trusted that guidance meant care. Trusted that silence was sometimes the price of opportunity. Each success reinforced the belief that compliance worked. There were no public warning signs, no visible struggle, just steady progress and rising expectations. The machine rewarded her for staying composed, for not complicating things, for moving forward without resistance. This was the foundation of her career. Extraordinary talent shaped by early conditioning. Confidence built alongside caution. A child praised not for being protected, but for being manageable. And once that lesson is learned, it is very difficult to unlearn. At the height of her career, Aaliyah did something rare. She succeeded without spectacle. While the industry often rewarded excess, she moved in the opposite direction. Her music did not shout. It hovered. It breathed. There was space between the beats, restraint in her delivery, and confidence in what she chose not to do. That restraint became her signature. Critics struggled at first to describe it. Her sound was labeled futuristic, but it was also deeply controlled. Nothing felt accidental. Every pause felt intentional. Every vocal choice felt measured. She proved that power did not require volume, and that presence could exist without confrontation. Commercial success followed quickly. Albums sold in the millions. Radio embraced her. Awards and nominations confirmed what audiences already felt. She was not chasing relevance. She was defining it. Younger artists began borrowing from her style, often without realizing it. Her influence became embedded in the genre itself. At the same time, she expanded beyond music. Acting offered another space where her quiet intensity translated effortlessly. On screen, she carried the same calm authority. Reviewers noted how natural she appeared, how little she seemed to force emotion. Once again, she did not demand attention. She earned it. Publicly, she appeared composed and self-assured. Interviews were polite. Answers were careful. She rarely spoke in absolutes. When asked about the past, she redirected. When pushed toward discomfort, she smiled and moved forward. The industry praised her professionalism, but professionalism can be misunderstood. Behind that polished exterior was someone who had learned to compartmentalize. Success became both shield and proof. As long as she kept achieving, questions stopped coming. As long as she remained agreeable, doors stayed open. The discipline that elevated her career also kept her guarded. She spoke often about wanting to be more than a singer, not because she was dissatisfied, but because she was driven. She wanted longevity, control, ownership over her future, to be recognized not just for talent, but for consistency and vision. This period represented everything she had worked for. Artistic freedom, respect, momentum. For the first time, it felt like she was truly steering her own path. Yet even at her peak, something remained unspoken. The silence was still there, refined, managed, hidden beneath achievement. The world saw balance. What it did not see was the effort it took to maintain it. What happened next was never explained in full. Not by her, not by the people around her, and certainly not by the industry that benefited from her continued success. When she was still underage, she was placed under the creative direction of R. Kelly, a man whose authority in the music business was unquestioned at the time. The collaboration was presented as mentorship, as guidance, as opportunity. But behind the professional framing, boundaries began to disappear. Later allegations described a relationship that should never have existed. An imbalance of age, of power, of control. She was a teenager. He was an adult with influence, resources, and protection. Yet instead of intervention, there was accommodation. Instead of alarm, there was denial. When court records eventually surfaced, they confirmed what many had suspected, but few were willing to confront. A secret marriage. Documents falsified to make her appear older than she was. An attempt to legitimize something that could not be justified. For those who understood the implications, it was devastating. What followed was not accountability. It was erasure. The marriage was annulled. Records were sealed. The narrative was redirected. She was removed from the situation quietly and returned home. Public discussion faded. The industry moved on. He continued working, producing, winning. She did not speak. Not because nothing happened, but because speaking carried consequences. At that stage of her life, silence was the safest option. Survival required control, and control required restraint. When asked in interviews, she redirected. When confronted privately, she shut down the subject entirely. To those closest to her, she offered only a few words. That he was a bad man. The psychological weight of that choice was immense. Trauma was not processed. It was contained, locked away behind professionalism and progress. She kept working, kept showing up, kept delivering excellence. To the outside world, this looked like resilience. In reality, it was endurance. She learned to live with unanswered questions, with unresolved damage, with the knowledge that the system would protect itself before it ever protected her. And still, she refused to let it define her publicly. There was no breakdown, no scandal attached to her name, just a continued commitment to forward motion, to achievement, to silence. But silence, even when chosen, always takes something in return. For many years, the public story remained incomplete. In the United States, the conversation around Aaliyah focused almost entirely on achievement. Her grace, her influence, her untouchable image. The discomfort surrounding her early experiences was treated as background noise, something impolite to examine too closely. Media coverage followed the same pattern. Serious allegations were softened by language, framed as controversy instead of harm, as rumors instead of violations. The industry relied on ambiguity, and ambiguity allowed everyone to keep moving forward without consequence. Outside the U.S., the story traveled even more selectively. Her music crossed borders faster than the truth ever could. International audiences embraced her sound and style with little access to the full context of what she had endured. The image remained intact. The questions remained distant. It was not until cultural attitudes began to shift that the silence started to feel unacceptable. As conversations around abuse, consent, and power finally reached the mainstream, people began revisiting stories that had been ignored. What once felt uncomfortable to confront became necessary to acknowledge. The realization was painful. This was not a case of misunderstanding. It was a failure of protection. Even after her death, the pattern persisted. Decisions continued to be made about her work without universal agreement that they reflected her wishes. When her catalog was released on streaming platforms years later, the response was deeply divided. Some celebrated access. Others questioned intent. Her estate publicly objected, stating they had fought for decades to prevent her legacy from being controlled by those who had failed her. The announcement of posthumous projects intensified the discomfort. To some, it felt like honoring her artistry. To others, it felt like the continuation of exploitation under a more polished name. The timing raised concerns. The authority behind the releases raised questions. What became clear was this: recognition came far too late. Sympathy arrived without accountability. The industry learned how to speak more carefully, but not necessarily how to act differently. Her story forced a broader reckoning, not just about one artist, but about how many others learned to survive quietly. How many were praised for composure instead of protected from harm. The world finally began listening. But listening does not undo the cost of being unheard for so long. On August 25, 2001, her life ended in seconds. A small aircraft lifted off when it should not have. Overloaded, piloted by someone unqualified, pushed forward by urgency instead of care. The crash happened less than a minute after takeoff. She was 22 years old. What followed was grief, shock, headlines, tributes. The world mourned the loss of a rising star. But once again, the full truth arrived slowly. Investigations revealed negligence at nearly every level. Decisions that ignored warnings. A system that valued schedules over safety. And buried beneath those details was one final, haunting pattern. She did not want to fly. She resisted. And yet, her consent once again became negotiable. It is impossible to separate her death from the life she lived before it. A life shaped by other people's authority, other people's urgency, other people's decisions. Even in her final moments, control was something taken from her, not granted. Yet what remains is not helplessness. What remains is impact. Her music continues to sound unbothered by time. Her influence lives in the quiet confidence of modern R&B, in the restraint artists now admire, in the way softness can still carry strength. She changed how women could sound without demanding attention, how they could move without explanation, how they could lead without shouting. But her legacy is also a warning. It asks us to look beyond success and ask who is being protected along the way, to question industries that reward silence, to recognize how often composure is mistaken for consent and endurance for healing. Even years after her passing, battles over her work continue. Releases she did not approve. Decisions she cannot contest. The struggle to honor her wishes did not end with her life. Rest, it seems, was never simple. And yet, her voice remains untouched. Calm, clear, undeniably hers. She once said that work made her happy, that doing what she loved gave her purpose. In that truth, her presence still exists. Not as a victim, not as a headline, but as an artist who gave everything she had, quietly, completely. If her story stayed with you, let's stay honestly. Remember the music, but also remember the cost. And if her voice ever carried you through a moment of your own, share that memory. Because honoring her means more than admiration. It means making sure silence is never mistaken for strength again.